Way back on March 31st, Joe Biden predicted optimistically that gas prices would drop as much as 35 cents as a result of his plan to tap the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This after gas prices hit all-time record highs earlier that month.
How much in monetary terms do you estimate today's announcement will reduce gas prices?
My guess is we'll see it come down, continue to come down. Better part of, anything from 10 cents to 35 cents a gallon.
Well, 6 weeks later, and that guess, just like many of his other instincts, is completely incorrect, at least in any long-term or sustained sense. The national average gas price today is about a dime higher than it was when Biden made that prediction, though in fairness, there was a very slight dip, about a dime in the other direction in the interim. Regardless, where Biden predicted we'd be as much as 10% lower in price today, instead, we're still setting new all-time record highs. Benefit of hindsight, though, perhaps he might say, but not really. You didn't need some fancy degree or decades of experience or some genius political or economic foresight to see then what is even more obvious. Now, the numbers just don't add up to meaningfully change the math that sets the price of every good, supply and demand. His strategic oil reserve release is a literal drop in the bucket, statistically. Biden is pumping out 1 million barrels a day from the reserve for a country that consumes 20 million barrels a day. A supply accounting for 5% of the demand just isn't going to have any sort of significant effect. And that's even assuming that demand is constant, which it isn't. We're heading into a summer season when demand increases, and as more people come out this year over years prior, demand will exceed recent history, and supply will have to catch up to new heights, not old benchmarks. So unless you want to stop people from going places and moving things and just engaging economically in general, you have one and only one option to change the equation and lower or even just moderate gas prices. You got to increase supply. The trouble is, this administration doesn't much like that side of the equation. Week one of his presidency, Biden halted new oil and gas drilling leases on federal land. Day one of his presidency, he revoked the cross-border permit to finish the Keystone XL pipeline that would have moved Canadian crude to U.S. refineries more efficiently. Just this week, Biden's Interior Department announced the cancellation of drilling leases in Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico, citing, quote, a lack of industry interest in leasing in the area in Alaska and legal obstacles in the Gulf. And that lack of industry interest is a common scapegoat for this White House. Oh, don't look at us. The leases are out there. It's those greedy oil companies who won't do the work.
There are 9,000 approved drilling permits that are not being used. So the suggestion that we are not allowing companies to drill is inaccurate. So I would suggest you ask the oil companies why they're not using those if there's a desire to drill more.
Well, if I'm an oil company and I know that I have to take on the risk of exploration, and I have to take on the risk of securing funding, and I have to take on the risk of setting up all the necessary infrastructure, and I have to take on all the risks that actually extracting that oil entails. If I do all of that, only to be slapped with lawsuits or new regulations or any number of unpredictable obstacles that keep popping up under this presidency, why would I take on those risks at all? Often, I wouldn't. And so often, they don't. When the government cites lack of interest to explain lack of drilling, note they don't explain why the lack of interest, other than to imply or outright state that the oil companies are greedy. But it's awfully odd that a business motivated solely by greed would refuse such an easy money-making opportunity. And of course, even if the money-making opportunity is as easy as we're supposed to believe, at least from a regulatory perspective, we've created an economy in which it's not so easy either. The oil and gas industry, like most others, was ravaged by government lockdown policies, reducing demand and leading to the layoffs of hundreds of thousands of employees. You don't just flip that level of human resources back on. These people need to be rehired, retrained, and redeployed. Additional costs the oil companies must assume that factor into the financial risk calculation of going to get that oil. When demand is high, and supply is constrained, prices will increase. There's just no way around that, assuming, of course, that you limit yourself to economic realities. But that's the thing about this president and his party. They often don't do that. And so with a trip to imagination land, instead, it's not just increased supply or reduced demand. There is, in fact, a third option if you want to reduce the price of gas. just control it. That's right, we'll just ban high gas prices. That's the new genius plan coming from Nancy Pelosi and her congressional colleagues. No, it can't be that high gas prices might have something to do with insufficient production, which might have something to do with government regulation. No, it's all corporate greed. And if it's all corporate greed, we'll just ban corporate greed.
Price gouging needs to be stopped. This is a major exploitation of the consumer because this is a product the consumer must have. Again, the Putin tax hike at the pump is a part of this, and you would think that the oil companies would compensate for that rather than exploit the opportunity that it. So, and this bill, what this bill does, price gouging needs to be addressed, including new tools at the FTC.
Well, even if we grant that point on Putin, that Russia's actions have reduced international supply and U.S. oil companies should compensate, how exactly would they do that compensation? Would it be by increasing production? And if so, might they do that on their own, considering they have a financial incentive to, if only you would get the hell out of the way? But they can't get the hell out of the way. They only step in one direction, and that's toward the neck of American freedom and prosperity. It's hilarious. People often ridicule their critics by asking, well, what do you think, bro? That the government sets gas prices? That's not the way it works, bro. Well, one, that's kind of how it works, at least indirectly, when the government sets up an obstacle course that significantly increases prices. But two, in this case, that's actually how it works. Congress is proposing actual price controls. Pelosi is planning a vote on a bill next week, the Consumer Fuel Price Gouging Prevention Act, that would ban quote-unquote excessive or exploitative gas prices. The Federal Trade Commission would be given the power to penalize oil companies for such violations, instructed to target large companies and not small, independently owned gas stations. Now, of course, there's no guarantee in the House, and it's a no-chance proposition in the Senate, so this isn't going to happen as a reality. But even in concept, it's important to understand this nonsense. What is an excessive or exploitative price? Who decides such things? In fact, what is it that sets a price in general? Is it the costs that producers assume to bring a product to market in combination with what consumers are willing to pay for that product? Or is it just some subjective government decision? And if we're bucking reality and going with subjective government decision, well, what exactly incentivizes anybody to bring a product to market, knowing they might be punished by the government for their efforts? In other words, if I know that I'll be punished for bringing a product to market at a price that makes it worth my effort, then I'll just not bring that product to market and avoid the hassle. That will create reduced supply, not increased supply. So even if you think that price controls will keep gas affordable, it doesn't matter how cheap gas is when there's none to buy at all. And we can call that right-wing propaganda, or we can properly call that reality. That's the frustrating thing about this idea. It's not some creative, exciting new theory about how to fix a modern problem. It has been historically attempted. And invariably, it historically fails. And not just in other countries or with other goods or in different scenarios. In our country, with the same good, in the same situation. In the 70s, we faced a very similar predicament. Foreign oil sources became restricted. At the time, it was an OPEC embargo. The constrained supply increased prices for U.S. consumers, and so President Nixon tried this idea. He imposed gasoline price controls. The price controls not only exhausted the existing supply, but they disincentivized new production by diminishing the prospect for profit, which of course didn't lead to affordability or availability. It led to rationing. Instead of gas readily available at a price you can accept or decline, you get hours in line and closed shops, with fewer people or nobody at all incentivized to create solutions. Indeed, an analysis from a Harvard economist concluded the price controls in the 70s caused an artificial shortage of 1.5 million barrels a day. There was only one way out of that mess, and it was not through the guidance of a centralized government plan. Instead, it was through the removal of that. Reagan took office in 1981 and pulled the reverse Joe Biden. Immediate deregulation. by abolishing what remained of the price controls. And by 1986, that deregulation of the oil industry led to record production levels, which led to a reduction in prices down toward $10 a barrel. So if we're even going to consider this nonsense coming from Nancy Pelosi in Congress next week, number one, don't. But number two, if we do, at least make them explain why this same idea produced disaster last time around, not solution. This isn't some abstract concept. This is part of their lifetimes. Nancy Pelosi was 33 years old the last time we tried this. She remembers what went wrong then. So how and why does she expect any sort of different result this time? Unless, of course, she doesn't. Unless she knows exactly what this idea will do, and she wants that. It's getting harder and harder to believe that these people are just bad at their jobs, and not just easy, but compelling to believe that they're actually intentionally destructive with them. But even if they are implausibly well-meaning, I am still much more inclined to believe the wisdom from the guy who actually resolved this issue in the past. Always beware the promise.
I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
And it's extra important when it's I've been in government longer than you've been alive, and I'm here to help. Right after my Botox appointment, and my gelato break, and my maskless salon visit that's banned for you. With all of those priorities on your dime, she has no time to help you anyway. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Minds, that is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.